Hello, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this webinar entitled Moldova's Democratic Progress on the Path to EU Membership Against the Backdrop of Looming Russian Threats, organized within the framework of the international REDEMOS research project. My name is Tobias Schumacher. I'm a professor of European Studies at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology here in Trondheim, Norway. I'm a senior professorial fellow at the College of Europe in Natolin. And most importantly, in today's context, I guess I am the deputy coordinator of this very project called REDEMOS. I have the pleasure of being your host today and moderate the conversation with Anastasia Pociumban and Denis Cenusa, who, as I said, will join us anytime soon, who I obviously both welcome very warmly and thank for being part of this webinar. And it goes without saying that I will introduce the two of them in more detail in a moment. Now, before I do that and also make a few introductory remarks about today's topic, allow me to just say one or two words about REDEMOS itself, as not everyone that is with us this afternoon is familiar about our work and the project itself. REDEMOS is actually an abbreviation. It stands for Reconfiguring EU Democracy Support Towards a Sustained Demos in the EU's Eastern Neighborhood. It's an international research project financed by the European Union's Horizon Europe program, and it runs from the 1st of January 2023 until the end of December next year. Under the leadership of my colleague, Dr. Magdalena Dobrescu, myself, and our team here at NTNU in Trondheim, REDEMOS brings together a total of 11 European universities, research centers, think tanks, as well as one web solution-oriented small and medium-sized enterprise from Athens. The total budget is approximately 3.7 million euro, and REDEMOS is destined to generate cutting-edge research and provide policy advice to the European Union with respect to EU and EU member states' democracy support efforts in what Brussels considers to be, or maybe I should actually say considered to be, its Eastern neighborhood. REDEMOS is officially mandated by the European Union to elaborate a new and improved policy toolkit for future-proofing democracy, so to speak, in Eastern Europe, and to shift from, say, repeating past mistakes to tackling present challenges, particularly in light of a significantly altered, or rather altering, European security landscape. Now, this brings me directly to today's topic, in a way, and I would like to begin by saying that arguably Moldova, sandwiched in between Romania and war-torn Ukraine, is particularly exposed to these alterations of both the regional and the European security landscape, not least as Russia's unjustified and unprovoked war of aggression on Ukraine has had and continues to have a multi-layered impact, if you wish, on the country and arguably its path towards consolidating democratic rule and becoming an EU member state. So, for one, being a direct neighbor of Ukraine obviously means that ever since Russia's war of aggression started, Moldova has been faced with the more or less continuous threat that Russia may escalate the stakes and also attack Moldova. Concerns that Russia may aim at creating a land corridor into the separatist region of Transnistria have become more muted, as we all know, since 2023, not least thanks to Ukraine's resilience and determination and its ability to defend its southwestern regions. Yet, this very threat, even though not necessarily most imminent, is still on the horizon, arguably, as is the possibility that Russia may draw Transnistria into the war in different ways. And I think the various drone and missile incidents, some of which were apparently false flag operations by Russia, occurring on Moldovan territory since the autumn of 2022, have to be seen in this light. Likewise, Russian attempts to destabilize Moldova and possibly even overthrow the democratically elected PAS-led government are real, and they continue to take place by means of, for example, using domestic proxies such as the Shore Party or systematic disinformation and cyber attack campaigns, if you wish. Obviously, this external interference by the Kremlin has no other objective than, as I said, to destabilize and to derail Moldova's democratic development and to espouse pro-Russian and thereby anti-Western views. And this is all the more so as Moldova has not just managed to end the period of oligarchic state capture that marked the country particularly, though not necessarily exclusively, during the period between 2016 and 2019. And since 2021 has embarked on a truly, I would say, impressive reform process. I think it is more than accurate to say that these democratic reforms that Moldova has pursued over the past 3 years effectively, also whilst hosting hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian refugees, is owed to the vigor and collective action of a critical segment of Moldovan elites, civil society, and a general public, as well as the leadership of President Maia Sandu. And it has earned, as we all know, Moldova an EU candidate status and even the start of accession talks, which began, as we all know, 3 months ago. Now, how these and many other more recent developments in and around Moldova are impacting its domestic, political, and thus democratic development, and likewise how domestic and possibly regional dynamics affect Moldova's upcoming presidential elections and the EU membership referendum in exactly 27 days from now, will be very much at the center of today's webinar, featuring, as I said, Anastasia Pociumban, and once he eventually joins us, Denis Cenusa. So by way of introducing our 2 guest speakers, let me start by saying that Anastasia Pociumban is a research fellow at the Center for Order and Governance in Eastern Europe, Russia and Central Asia at the German Council on Foreign Relations, the DGAP in Berlin, where she also manages the think tank network on the Eastern Partnership, which is, I guess most of you know that, an important initiative initiated by the DGAP in 2020 with the support of the European Commission. Before joining DGAP, Anastasia has worked for the Lyon-based Equal Rights and Independent Media. She worked at Democracy Reporting at the European Endowment for Democracy, and she's also a co-founder of the Brussels Binder, which is a very important platform. If you haven't heard of it yet, let me just say that is a very important platform for improving gender balance in policy debates. And most of all, Anastasia is a very well-known analyst and observer of Moldova, Eastern Europe, and corresponding EU policies towards the region. A very warm welcome to you, Anastasia, and mulțumesc mult for being with us this very afternoon. Even though Denis has not yet joined us, allow me to just say a word or 2 about him as well. Denis Cenusa, our other guest speaker today, is a lecturer at the Institute of Political Science at the Justus Liebig University in Gießen, Germany. He is the head of the European Integration Program at the Expert-Grup in Chișinău, and a very, I would say, influential risk analyst, in the field of geopolitics, in particular when it comes to hybrid warfare and geoeconomics. So he's working a lot on critical infrastructure, routes, minerals, you name it, in Russia and the post-Soviet space. Denis is also an associate expert at the Eastern European Studies Center in Vilnius, and as most of you probably know, quite a prolific and well-informed writer. As I said, even though for some reason he has not yet joined us, I would sort of in absentia, so to speak, like to welcome him as well for eventually joining us a little later. So after all these very lengthy, forgive me for that, introductory remarks, I would now like to give the digital floor, so to speak, to our two speakers. First of all, obviously to Anastasia. The idea was for each one of them to provide us with a bit of an impulse at the very beginning of this conversation of some 5 to 10 minutes max, where each one of them would engage, so to speak, with the topic, the theme of today's webinar. And I would then eventually pick up maybe on some of the points raised, ask 2 or 3 questions before I would then bring in you, that is to say, our audience, for an interactive, ideally Q&A session. On that note, once again, thank you very much for being with us, Anastasia, and most of all, obviously, for being on time, so to speak. And I suggest we get started. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tobias, and thank you for this introduction as well. I also hope Denis joins us soon. It's very nice to be in this group of friends and experts on Moldova. And I am also very glad to join you from Chișinău, in fact, where I am now for a couple of days. And I thought just to outline the key challenges related to the upcoming elections, and then we start from there. So I think what's important is that the current geopolitical situation in Moldova is marked by the upcoming elections and the constitutional referendum on EU integration. Moldova's EU orientation has taken a central stage, and Maia Sandu, that you all know very well, is the pro-European president, is leading the polls, while Alexandru Stoianoglu, a former prosecutor general supported by Dodon and the Socialist Party, is currently second, polling at around 10–11%. In this current election, there is a division which looks mostly like at Moldova's deeper geopolitical struggle, but also I think it highlights the current socio-economic tensions that exist. Moldova's situation is profoundly shaped by external crises, and Russia's invasion of Ukraine has triggered economic instability, energy shortages, and security concern. This, all in all, have impacted government's ability to focus on domestic reforms. Despite these external pressures, Moldova achieved EU candidate status and opened accession talks, was invited to open accession talks in June this year, which was a monumental step towards solidifying Moldova's alignment with EU, but it also came as a response to the geopolitical situation and to Russia's aggression of Ukraine. And EU's road is also filled with domestic challenges. Reforms in governance, judiciary, and anti-corruption are urgent priorities, and they require sustained political will. The government's ability to translate EU integration into concrete benefits for Moldova remain crucial, and I would also argue, they still haven't been translated. Public support for European integration is fragile, particularly in Gagauzia, where pro-Russian sentiment is prevalent. The Gagauz region remains a focal point of resistance to European integration, and mostly it's due to its economic ties and socio-economic situation, as well as Shor's party that instrumentalizes it. The upcoming presidential elections and the constitutional referendum, they're also very important for Moldova's EU's future. A win for Sandu would reinforce her mandate, allowing also her party path which is Party of Action and Solidarity, to further push its European agenda. And also, I think it would help for the upcoming parliamentary elections next year in 2025. As many of you know, currently PAS has a majority in the Moldovan parliament, but according to the polls, that won't be the case for the next elections. And should Maia Sandu, should the referendum be unsuccessful towards EU integration, that would also decrease the support for the party. What's also interesting, if Maia Sandu, which looks, I mean, I would also say currently it looks like Maia Sandu would win the elections, but from the second round, not from the first. And she would be only the second Moldovan president to win the second term after Vladimir Voronin. So you can see Moldova in its 30 years of independence had quite a lot of changes in the government, in the parliament, and it's not so easy to keep the power, if I may say so. And while with the EU, with Maia Sandu, it looks like she is likely to win, the situation with the referendum is a bit trickier. First, there is a requirement of 33.3% of participation. And I mean, in the beginning, this looked like a challenge. However, I'm more optimistic now. But the polls show support between 49 and 60% for the referendum, depending on the poll you look like. So I think getting this 50 plus 1% support for the referendum still remains a challenge. And people are different organizations and also think tanks and some pro-European forces are fighting for hearts and minds also around Moldova. And I think the role of Russia in the upcoming elections and referendum cannot be underestimated, especially in case of the referendum. Moscow has long and strategic interest in keeping Moldova within its sphere of influence. Russian interference manifests through disinformation campaigns, cyber attacks, and especially financial backing of pro-Russian political fractions, and especially Lance Shor's party. These campaigns exploit public fears that joining EU will drag Moldova into a war with Russia, or another narrative promoted also by pro-Russian parties that Maia Sandu is using the referendum to using the referendum to kind of like associate the EU agenda with only its party, and as well as that the EU doesn't want Moldova as its member. So this has been very much been instrumentalized in Moldova. And beyond political division, I think one of the main challenges is the economic one, the high inflation and energy dependency, as well as have been driving voter concerns. Just to remind you, in the end of 2022, the inflation in Moldova was 34%. So the economic issues have been are currently now in the first of priorities according to the polls. So it's economic challenges, corruption, and only then somewhere later the security comes. However, security remains a top priority for the government. The proximity to Ukraine, historical Russian influence, and constant hybrid operations from Russia, as well as illicit flows of money supporting Russian proxies are a present danger. These threats not only destabilize Moldova, but they also consume already scarce administrative resources from the government. I think this also is one of the main challenges. And just to conclude, so we can have a discussion. So I think while on the one hand, EU integration remains a crucial goal for Moldova, there is also a pact for Moldova signed by now 13 political parties to commit, reflecting a commitment towards European values and Moldova's EU accession. There is also a concern that PAS is trying to monopolize the EU accession agenda, and some parties feel alienated. And the outcome of these elections will have important implications for Moldova's future. And in a way, one can say Moldova is again at a crossroad, but we have been at so many crossroads. And I think what's important also is continuous support towards Moldova resilience and ensuring that Moldova is able to to receive this long-term committed support to overcome the challenges. I think Moldova has done a long path in the last 30 years, but also expecting that the changes and reforms will happen overnight is not, it's just not realistic. So I think I end here, and I think I try to provide you like a little overview of where we are at the moment, not going into Transnistria, Gagauzia, and to the energy issues yet.
All right, thank you so much, Anastasia. I think you gave us an excellent overview, and you kickstarted this webinar very, very nicely by touching upon, I would argue, the key issues that Moldova is faced with. You mentioned the slowdown of reforms. You mentioned attempts at meddling in the domestic affairs on the part of Russia. You mentioned public concerns with respect to the economy, socioeconomic problems, and how these relate effectively to why the reform agenda of Maya Sandu, I wouldn't want to say has come to a standstill, but has sort of slowed down. You touched upon issues related to judiciary, anti-corruption reforms, etc. I think we will go into all of them in one way or another over the next 45 minutes, possibly also with our audience. As I'm saying all this, I learn here that Denis Cenusa is actually out there. He's trying to join us, but it seems that he has some technical problems. So as he is trying to come in, I would then like to already ask a first question, Anastasia, picking up on the point related to external interference, and that obviously is all about Russia. How safe do you think will the upcoming elections and the membership referendum be, as far as these external attempts by Russia are concerned to influence, to distort the outcome? In other words, what has been done, to your knowledge, to counter foreign interference? Are there any safeguards that have been put in place? What are these?
Thank you. That's a very valid question. I think, first of all, Moldova is never safe from Russian interference, at least in the current situation. But like security, it was where Moldova achieved most progress in terms of reforms in the last 2 years. I have to say we started from a very low level, so it's also very challenging. But first of all, Moldova has put in place a new security strategy last year. And this new security strategy also clearly mentions Russia as the main threat to Moldova. It mentions Moldova's alignment with EU integration and Moldova's EU support to Moldova. Also Moldova's alignment with EU and NATO standards. So I think in a way there is also some sort of a framework. What's also interesting, and I think we can discuss it later in the discussion, is the first time that the Moldovan neutrality is not mentioned in the security strategy. And while neutrality is being supported by around 60% of the Moldovan population, that's also a step forward towards kind of presenting that maybe there is no safety while Russia is still there and being outside of NATO. However, there were also other mechanisms put in place. One of it was the EU monitoring mission set by the European Union, and especially targeting hybrid threats. It was on the request on Moldova, and it's supporting Moldova to deal also with the security reform, cyber reform, and also to address the hybrid threat and disinformation. I mean, Moldova has also done some measures in relation to disinformation. For instance, it suspended retransmission of news and political shows from Russia already in March 2022. Also, at the end of 2022, the authorities banned a further 6 channels related to Ilan Shor and Igor Dodon. I mean, I have to say, while these channels have been banned, they're still available via cable in Gagauzia. Another issue that Moldova has done, it's setup of Center for Strategic Communication and Combating Disinformation. It's kind of a new Stratcom. It's a consultative organ, and it is led by Anna Revenko, who's a former Minister of Interior. So, I mean, in this regard, Moldova has been learning from the Baltic states on how to deal with disinformation. The competences of the Audiovisual Council have been extended as well, and the word disinformation was introduced into legislation. So this is like from more a legal perspective. I mean, of course, it's still a path to get there. So I would say what still needs to be done is also define the competences of each organ, who is dealing with what issues particularly, and also especially with the Center for Strategic Communication. I mean, it has only a consultation role. Some other actions from the government that happened. I mean, I think you have read about banning the Ilan Shor party and declaring it unconstitutional, which is a very radical measure in a way. And what happened after is that there was a new party founded called Victory, Pobeda, and a few more parties emerged. So while on the one hand, this was a tool to address the issue in a short run ahead of the local elections, I mean, I would argue that was not such a sustainable solution, but I think this also comes in response to the government being overstretched. So I could also mention some more examples of measures that have been taken to address the short-term challenges, but in a long run, they did not solve the issue. I mean, I think there is also more cooperation between security organs also to stop the illicit money inflows in the country. But again, if you ask me, like some of the measures were to confiscate money in the airport from people arriving. And this has not always, like the law says that you can bring 10,000 euros. And there was this incident where money have been confiscated when they were in less amount without undergoing first the judicial, like any court cases, right? So I also expect some of this money will be claimed back because they were confiscated without legal grounds. But in a way, overall, I think the government stepped up its security strategies and plans. Also in response to this ongoing measures, but in a way, I also say it has been in the first 2 years of Russia's war in Ukraine, it has also a bit like extinguishing the fire. So there's been mostly emergency responses to the existing situation. It has now a bit improved. So there is the security strategies. There are some mechanisms that are being put in place. There is also, in terms of cyber attacks, there is a new cybersecurity law, which is also addressing an effort to build resilience against cyber threats. So, I mean, I think I maybe stop here, but these are some, and let me know if you want me to elaborate on some of the topics.
Thank you so much, Anastasia. I think this was very comprehensive and gives us a very good idea. I must say that initially we were thinking to open the Q&A only in about 15 minutes or so, but as we just received a very pertinent question precisely on this very issue that we have just been talking about, I would at least like to bring in this very question, which was posed by a participant, namely Laura Worsch, who is actually asking what the government has been doing, is doing to inform the regions about the EU membership referendum, and in particular those regions where Russian disinformation is particularly high, such as Gagauzia. Maybe you can say a word or two about that as well.
I think it's, on the one hand, I think the government started informing the regions too late. You know, once the referendum has been announced, like you can see it from two sides. On the one hand, the government's position was total non-engagement with Gagauzia since Evgenia Gutsul was elected. She is affiliated with Shor. She's also accused for voters buying. And the government's position is that you can't engage with basically a criminal authority. However, on the other hand, I would also say there was no engagement before. I mean, there was no candidate from PAS in Gagauzia to run for Bashkan elections. Bashkan is the regional governor of Gagauzia. So I mean, I think not enough has been done prior to the referendum's announcement. At the same time, I was honestly asking my question this also after I've been for interviews to Gagauzia, why is it the case? And I think the government just has been also overstretched. You know, they were elected on the promise of reforms, and then there was COVID, then there was the energy crisis, and Russia's full-scale aggression of Ukraine, which led to 1 million refugees passing through Moldova, the economy and energy crisis. So I believe there's been, like, I mean, you know, Gagauzia was receiving mostly like quite a lot of EU funding. And now, since there are no official channels of engagement on the government level since December between the authorities in Chișinău and the Gagauz authorities, there is engagement on the local level with mayors, but not with the Bashkan. But there have been, at the same time, since the referendum has been announced, there have been campaigns also from PAS, but also I have seen groups of people united for the referendum to campaign, traveling to the regions and talking about EU integration and informing about it. It's also has been the role of the EU monitoring mission to support with it, as far as I know. But again, you know, I would also argue it has happened a little bit too late. And also, I think more could have been done, should have been there, the capacities at an earlier stage, and not now, just after the referendum has been announced.
Thank you, Anastasia. Thank you. And finally, we are having the opportunity to welcome Denis in person, who finally joins us. It's good to have you eventually with us, Denis. Great to seeing you, and thank you for being with us. We have introduced you already. We have already started the conversation, as you can imagine. But obviously, I would like to take the opportunity now that you are there to bring you in ASAP and maybe pick up on one of the points that Anastasia has just touched upon in her introductory remarks. And that relates to the current polling, opinion polls, where Sandu is in terms of public support ahead of the presidential elections on the 20th of October, as well as with respect to the EU membership referendum. What if, Denis, what if eventually we ended up in a situation where Maia Sandu wins the elections, arguably in the second round, but does not get the outcome that she has been campaigning for in the referendum? What will that mean for her own tenure, for her second mandate eventually, and more importantly, for Moldova's future democratic / EU European trajectory?
Thank you very much for having me, and sorry for being late. I had also some technical issues, but finally we managed to get me online. Yeah, I think that first of all we have to speak about whether the referendum will influence chances of Maia Sandu to be in the second round. I think that that's the first question, because if we have a poor performance at the referendum, then most likely that will also influence the results for the second round. And I think that this is exactly the biggest risk we can say. And there is a big interest for the current government to have as many people as possible voting during the referendum. I think that at some point I had the feeling that the referendum is even more important, the turnout for the referendum is even more important than the turnout for the elections themselves, because it is clear that she's going to be in the first round. But in order to increase her chances to win in the second round, it is very important to actually have a very strong participation of the population. And I think that this causality may play out differently than we think. And I think that that's also one of the goals of those who are promoting against at the referendum, or for the for the boycott of this exercise. So they understand very well that if this happens, if there is a lower result, or let's put it, a low legitimacy for the referendum, then that can be exploited against Maya Sandu in the runoff. And then obviously everybody else is trying to also, everybody else, I mean external partners, if you carefully read what they say when they come to Chișinău, you'll notice that the referendum is there. So between the lines about the support for Moldova, you'll also see something mentioned about the referendum, either explicitly or somehow, indirectly, because they also understand. So there is a common understanding that the referendum is so much attached to Maya Sandu that the result or the outcome of the referendum will impact her.
Oh, if I were to push you on that particular point, would you go so far to say that a negative outcome in the referendum would possibly, or rather even most likely, push Maya Sandu to withdraw from the second round?
No, I think that will not happen in any of the worst scenarios that we can imagine. But that's a good question, a good scenario to analyze. What I think that can happen, that even if the referendum is valid, so we have enough votes, in a turnout that is good enough to consider the referendum valid, but it is not beyond 40%, beyond 50%, then it will be anyway presented as a failure, of Maya Sandu and of the entire campaign. Because let's agree that we talk about the referendum since December last year, and it's not only about Maya Sandu, it's also about the government, it's also about the civil society organizations, mass media. So it's not only one person. We speak about many stakeholders that are trying to convince the public that this referendum is important for the country, and therefore actually sticking even more the referendum to the to the image of Maya Sandu. So then we will see how much people will support the referendum, but I'm pretty much sure that it will leave a deep mark on Maya Sandu's chances in the second round.
Thank you, Denis. So on this point, and to sort of rephrase what I was asking initially, so let us assume that eventually we get to a situation where the turnout has been decent, the referendum is being considered valid, the final result of the referendum is, say, 51%. Sandu being re-elected, arguably most likely in the second round of the elections. What would that, in your view, then mean for Moldova's future democratic trajectory, and most of all, with respect to reinvigorating the reform drive, to sort of get out of this situation where, as Anastasia has very aptly described a moment ago, the priority, the main concerns of the public are on the economy, inflation, to some extent corruption, obviously, but where reforms have slowed down recently. Would you think that, or would you argue that this would then lead to a situation where there would be a new push for democratic reform, and where the government then itself would sort of reinforce this drive that sort of lost over the past couple of months?
To be honest, there is a high level of dissatisfaction, and I mean, if you don't want, if the external audience don't want to notice that, then this is it's about not reading properly the audience and the context. Because as Anastasia rightly mentioned, you look into surveys and you'll see that socioeconomic issues are persistent, they are predominant, and they're very painful because they affect the most vulnerable. And exactly those vulnerable segments are going to react to the results of referendum, regardless if it's positive or negative. So what I want to say is that if referendum wins, I mean, if those who support the referendum win, then it doesn't mean that Shore and others that right now are negatively directed and addressing toward the referendum will stop talking about the outcome of the referendum. I actually think the opposite, that they are going to use the positive result to push forward the idea that this is a wrong decision, that it was very much artificially imposed to the population, that it was external support for this vector. So everything will be used to the extent that it will be useful for the electoral campaign in 2025 for the legislative elections. So regardless which will be the result of the referendum, it will be used by those forces that are against it at the moment. Just because for them it's very important to even like show that there is a minimum. So a success will be presented as something that is rigged, something that was imposed, and it will be also serving for this narrative of victimization, that there is this kind of speculations about the external actors using the current government in order to impose an agenda that is not common, that is not useful for the population, so that they can mobilize people to vote at the legislative elections. So kind of like, okay, they won the referendum, but now we are going to be in the position to retaliate and to actually win the parliamentary elections in order to correct the mistake that was made in October 2024. That's my perception of how it's going to be used, exploited next year by the anti-EU forces in Moldova.
A quick question to the two of you. So I would like to bring in Anastasia on this one as well. As we speak about public perceptions, concerns over the economy, corruption, dissatisfaction with government policies, in particular in those fields. Could you possibly tell us in a few words something about public trust in political institutions as such? Bilaterally, trilaterally, we had this email exchange where I had mentioned the World Value Survey, you may remember, of 2014. Of course, it's outdated. Where it was particularly highlighted that, distrust in the political institutions in Moldova has been consistently high. Now, with the government being in power for 3 years, Maya Sandu running for re-election, can you detect by any chance any noticeable change as far as this public trust in political institutions is concerned, in the government, in the parliament, in political parties? Or would you say, when it comes to that particular point, Moldova is still very much stagnant? Maybe Anastasia, you first, in a nutshell.
Yeah, sure. I actually have looked up some information since you asked. I mean, I think unfortunately the situation has not changed so much. I would just mention some data from the IRI latest poll from this June. But I think what's interesting at the same time, what is high is the level of trust to local authorities. Local authorities are trusted at more than 70%. So, I mean, the question was like, how is the opinion of each of the following institutions? And I think the issue is that the government, for instance, even the Central Electoral Commission comes at 41%, and the presidential office comes at 36% trust, and the parliament comes also at 36% as well. So it's a higher distrust than trust. I mean, Prime Minister office also 36%, prosecutor's office 28%, and political parties are trusted at 27%, while the Court of Justice is the lowest from this at 22%. But I think what's interesting is that the local authorities and also foreign embassies, and I mean, according to the same survey, the European Union is actually trusted better than the Moldovan government. So, but But I would also argue that this comes due to the fact that we have not been having a stable political situation, and the governments that have been elected, in the end, while there was some progress, you know, the economic situation has remained quite fragile. There was no significant progress on the reforms that have been there. And at the same time, it's always easier to come from opposition, but then 4 years went by very quickly, and also due to external pressure and internal administrative resources, one can argue that on these promises, not so much have been achieved. So I think it also takes a very long time to build back this trust.
Thank you. Denis, over to you.
Well, to be honest, I think that the trust in formal institutions, like those that were mentioned by Anastasia, they were always low. I don't think that they have. I think that after the collapse of the USSR, for the state, for the political party system, it was very difficult to really build sustainable trust, public trust. And it was due to all mismanagement of the political parties, as well the structural issues that the country has and will have for a long time. I have to, again, be very objective in this regard and realistic. Moldova is still facing many issues which are exploited by external factors, right? We know very well that FIMI and all this hybrid warfare, they usually exploit the vulnerabilities that are there. They're inner, they exist, and they should be eradicated in order to reduce, right? To reduce the risks of external interference. Now, if we look at informal institutions, to which I actually attribute the church, then you'll see that it has like 70%, for instance, 65 up to 70%. And this was very consistently like preserved over the past 3 decades. So the church has been always good in the eyes of people. And I think that this is exactly how people are looking at the situation, right? Since in the moment you take the responsibility to run public affairs, then you will face this judgment day, which is during the elections, but also before the elections when we read the surveys, right? But it doesn't go the same way with the church, which actually doesn't really take any responsibility, right? So it's benefiting from the trust just because it doesn't have to really do any kind of governance deals in Moldova. And just a small remark before, because I see that you want to add something. Just a small remark to what Anastasia said about the public local administration. I think that what is important for people is that they know who they elect, who they select to be their mayors, and therefore they can ask from them. So there is a proximity to the decision-making process at the local level. So they trust more because they vote directly the mayor, and they can hold him or her accountable. This is exactly what is changing this picture and perspective about the institutions. Even if the mayors don't deliver, anyway, they know the mayor and they can punish in a way. They can castigate it in sense that I will not vote for you next time. It doesn't work the same way with the political party or other institutions which are far away, which are in Chișinău or are somewhere else. They are not reachable, so you cannot really punish them unless you speak about the parliamentary elections, which take place one time in 4 years.
I'm very grateful, Denis, that you bring in the role of informal institutions, and here in particular the church, because obviously, as we know from other countries in Eastern Europe, there is to some extent even a very strong alliance between the government on one hand and the church on the other, where the church is heavily being instrumentalized. Georgia is a case in point, for instance. Now, putting the argument on its head, considering the very prominent role of the church in Moldova and the very high trust that it sort of attracts in the public, why then, well, let me rephrase, would it not be strategically wise from the perspective of someone like Maya Sandu to tap precisely into that resource and positively instrumentalize it, so to speak?
Well, maybe Anastasia will definitely comment on that as well, because she's following closely the situation in Moldova. What I believe that is there is a double game, right? Everyone understands exactly this potential of the church to open resources to new electorate or new segments of the electorate. So everyone is aware of that. We know very well that Dodon was doing that. Before him, it was Voronin. So, and Timofte, not so much. I mean, the president who was before Dodon and after Voronin, he was not playing that much with this card. But Maia Sandu has been witnessed to be sometimes in some very small, circumstances close to the church. Well, she was not always parading around the church, obviously, because this is something that she was against when she was actually running for the presidency in 2016 and in 2020. But anyway, she was trying to do that. So which means that she understands very well that this is an asset that you have to use, but she's not overusing it so that it doesn't become too obvious, and she doesn't probably, create certain negativity, criticism from her own electorate that has been always telling that this is not the right way to actually use the church, instrumentalize it. What I think that is happening at the moment is that while she is trying to understand how much she can get close to the church, there are others that are very much speaking on behalf of the church. They don't have to go to the church. The only thing they can say, and they actually are really saying, emphasizing, is that they are promoting traditional values. And with that, they already make the connection with the church without going to the church, without kissing icons, without putting a candle. Anything of that is not necessary, because they already are advocating for the interest of the church. And I think that this is a big difference between Maia Sandu and her approach and the others who are very much Eurosceptics, or they are sovereignists, or they are pro-Russian, because not all the time they have the same profile, right? Sometimes it can match. There is an amalgamation of different profiles, but not all the time. So you have to look separately at different categories of politicians that are running against Maia Sandu.
Yeah, if I might just add, I would also agree with Denis that I think it would be a very tricky line to walk on. And we remember when Anastasia was elected, I think he put a cross in the building he was sitting, and that triggered a lot of demonstrations. And I think while 90% of Moldovans declare themselves as somehow religious, they would not want to, to vote for a party that is ultra religious. And we had also a Congress of Families hosted by Igor Dodon when he was a president. And I think when you have Maia Sandu on the one hand joining the pro-equality, or this, like in the marches in support for LGBTQI, I mean, it's called differently in Moldova, but like, I think it would be, she would really lose a part of electorate. But at the same time, it made me think that maybe the party should have someone working informally with the church to build some relations. But Moldovan church has been also a challenge, because as you know, we have the Moldovan metropoly and the Bessarabian metropoly, which also has been growing in its popularity. But in the last years especially, and with the war, at least from what I've been following, they did not endorse the Russian aggression in Ukraine, but they also did not condemn. In the Moldovan metropoly, in the beginning, their line was that they are praying for peace. So I think also association with the Moldovan metropoly that has been also linked with the Russian metropoly can be very tricky. And I think in the political parties, and I think Denis, you rightfully mentioned, so this association or this place has been already taken by the political actors, which are seen somehow pro-Russian. But I also, just wanted to add, I think also this trust in the churches, I am not even sure that people would then vote, based on the fact that they trust the churches. I think it's a very pragmatic thing to say that you trust the church, but even when you look on the practices or how much people actually follow all the religious practices, it's more for holidays and the official land, but it's not so much transposed into the daily values.
Thank you. Thank you, Anastasia. I think this is very helpful, what the two of us have just said. Before I raise the next question or take the liberty to raise the next question, somewhat contradicting what I said before when I said, let's bring in the audience as soon as possible. Let me remind each and everyone that is joining us this afternoon, if you have any question, please use the chat function. We will be happy to bring you in as of now. We have some 15 to 20 minutes max left, so we would be very, very happy to address your questions. In the meantime, as said, allow me to pose one more and maybe move a little on and touch upon the whole European side of things and the very fact that the negotiations, the accession negotiations were open on the 25th of June. If I'm not mistaken, today you have the opening of chapter 24 in Brussels, and the Deputy Prime Minister is there. Now, if we take that as a starting point, what are, in your view, the main stumbling blocks and challenges as far as these negotiations are concerned? And would you actually say, and maybe we can split the question into two, so maybe this one to you first, Denis, are there any stumbling blocks? And yeah, by the same token, the other question to you, Anastasia, are there any chapters that are likely to be particularly problematic, and if so, why?
Well, this is a very complex question, as you can imagine, because I think that the complexity of the EU enlargement negotiations is not fully understood in Moldova. Even if we have a lot of political attention and intention towards this process, it's simply too complicated, too quickly. So many things have happened probably too quickly, and there will be a necessity for time to transition to the moment when the state apparatus will be ready for really go smoothly ahead with every step of it. But at the moment, I think that it is right to start the negotiations with the most complicated one, because they are the trickiest. It's about it's the chapter 23 and 24. They are related to justice reform, which has been implemented in Moldova for some time, but in my view, it has also faced certain criticism because of the integrity of the process. So now I don't want to go into the particularity of that, because we will need another 5 hours for that. But I can tell you that as much as we want the process to be quick, we have to understand that it should be also qualitative, because this is exactly what we are told by our partners, by Moldovan partners in Chișinău. And I speak here about the ambassador of the EU to Moldova, Mr. Majeix. He's always emphasizing the necessity of having quality over, speed. And it's also something which is clearly understood by those that are coordinating the negotiation process in Brussels. If the process is made speedy just for the sake of showing for political purposes at home that the government is doing well, then we might find out during the elections or before the elections that actually many things didn't work out the way it was presented by the government. So I think that what can be done now, what should be done, that it should be a focus on professionalization of the process and less on politicization of the entire EU negotiation, story, because this is a long story. And that is why the focus should be really on hiring expertise, on absorbing expertise, because during the recent event in Helsinki, I was saying that unfortunately Moldova is facing the risk that the expertise it is benefiting right now will end when the consultancy projects will be not financed anymore by the EU, just because their deadline is over. So we have to make sure that all this information that is coming to support Moldova is also staying with the institutions, regardless of how many consultancy projects the EU is able to finance. And I think that this is something that we really should pay attention, and every time it's possible to somehow remind to our partners in Brussels, but also to those in Moldova that are involved in this, that this is not it's not a sprint. This is a long marathon, and we have to understand that it's a transition that will cost money, and that will also require a lot of buy-in in order to have public support, and also obviously support for the reforms that are part of this entire EU enlargement exercise.
Yeah, I think I would also agree that Moldova, in a way, Moldova received the candidate status too early, but it also, when it even submitted the application, it in a way had to do it because Ukraine and then Georgia applied. But like in a way, I would also say there was no capacity to actually deal with the whole process. And I mean, I think Moldova has also achieved quite a lot through this exercise. But I think the main issue will remain the fundamentals. I don't know if we should go into details on chapter 23 and 24, but the fundamentals, these are the chapters which will open first and close last according to the new revised methodology. I think, chapter 23 is the judicial and fundamental rights, and chapter 24 is justice and freedom and security. And Moldova will still have to deal with the corruption and judicial independence of the democratic institutions and governance. And especially also, I think the economic reforms remain a key issues. I know there was also a question about it in the discussion regarding Transnistria and how Transnistria can be integrated. But like, in a way, I would just say there is, all these things are possible to do. But like what is needed, I feel, and what is a priority for Moldova is really to continue this long-term support to build the resilience. We should not expect the things will happen overnight. And to me, for instance, what has been happening now in Georgia, it's really a lesson on how in a fragile setup, reforms can backslide, and there is always a potential for democratic backsliding or misuse of what is called European integration. So on the one hand, I think Moldova, and then I think another important topic in Moldova's own EU integration, and it's also the sustainability of the reform process, but also credibility on the EU side. I think the EU, and also with the new Commission for Enlargement, it has to show that the new enlargement is possible. And for this, we also need an internal EU reform. Because if we end up in 20 years, like the case of the Balkans, in the same discussion, then there has been a problem. I think EU's credibility is already a question, and I see it a lot, especially in the discussions that we have in parallel between the Eastern countries like Ukraine, Moldova, and potentially Georgia, and the Western Balkans. In the format where we bring actors together from all these countries, you really see a very big difference. I feel like in Moldova and Ukraine, there is now a momentum. There are challenges. I totally agree with this, and there is a long way forward, and we also have to prepare the population. What does it mean in a long run? But there also has to be like a credible response from the EU side.
Thank you to the two of you. We touch upon so many really crucial issues, and Denis mentioned this in a different context a moment ago. We could actually go on for another 5 hours. I fear we can't, at least as we are running out of time rather soon. But I would like to maybe then ask 2 or 3 more questions with a request to each one of you to be very short and sort of concise in addressing them. And all of them in one way or another touch upon what we have already discussed now, in particular now towards the end. You mentioned Transnistria just a second ago, Anastasia. There was a question by one of our participants, Ragnar Weiland, on Transnistria. I will not read it out now as we're running out of time and as you already engaged with that question in writing in the chat, but nonetheless sort of bring in Transnistria into this whole discussion on EU membership, the prospect of EU membership, the likelihood, the credibility then as far as the EU is concerned when it comes to that pledge, etc. Now, to start the point I'm trying to make and phrase it as a question, allow me to be a bit technical for a second. As we all know, the Moldovan, the Chișinău authorities have been, in a way, financing separatism. Insofar as, you know, Russian gas goes into Transnistria, where it is then being utilized by the power plant to produce electricity, which then is being sold to the Chișinău authorities and remunerated rather generously, so to speak. Now, as we all know, for the past 2.5 years, Moldova has been synchronizing its electricity grid with the European continental system and is advancing its connection, or connections rather, with and into the European high voltage grid. Now, if we eventually come to a point where, you know, the right bank of the Dnistru River is becoming electricity independent, so to speak, of Transnistria, and can at any point in time terminate this, how would you say, the electricity purchasing contract, so to speak, what would the impact be in terms of, you know, how should I say, adding fuel to fire, so to speak, when it comes to separatism and public opinion in Transnistria? What would it mean in terms of the viability of the Transnistrian entity, so to speak, as many argue that it would collapse more or less immediately, that this would lead to a massive humanitarian disaster in one way or another? And I'm asking that question in particular against the backdrop of the very fact that at the end of the day, how should I say, it's the very people, this very people on the left bank of the Dnistru that Maia Sandu wants to win over. So what will eventually happen once we get to the point where electricity is coming from elsewhere? Do you think, the two of you, that the Chișinău authorities will use that leverage vis-a-vis the Transnistrian authorities? Or are their hands actually tied? Can they get out of this conundrum, and how? And by extension, allow me then to ask a corresponding question, and that will probably be my last question, unless, of course, there are any questions. I see there's one more from, oh, we have even 4. That's amazing. So then I have to stop in a moment and bring in those questions as well from the audience. How realistic, having said what I just said, do you think it is that possibly at some point just the right bank of the Dnistru would be integrated fully or partially into the European Union? This was quite a monologue on my part. Please bear with me, and I apologize. Over to the two of you, maybe in a nutshell. Anastasia, you want to go first?
Sure, I'm sure Denis can add then. I want to start first with the fact that I think the Russia's war in Ukraine really changed the nature of relations between the two banks of the Dnistru River. So in a way, like however we look at it, but Moldovan authorities have been, or Moldova, the right bank of Moldova has been deleveraging from Transnistria. And Moldova's ability to also have the gas storages and the ability to procure electricity on the spot market has also changed the nature of the relations. And as you mentioned, the integration in the ENSO, what I mean has been the challenges, of course, the fact that 90% of the residents of Transnistria have Moldovan passports. But I think answering your question, whether it would be possible to sort this issue, I think the question is like how it would happen and when it would happen. So what has also changed, that if you ask people now in Chișinău, I think many people will name you the price by which Moldova buys gas from Transnistria and how much gas goes to Transnistria. That has really raised this financing of the regime on the surface. So it's not anymore an issue just between the authorities, it also has become a public issue. But at the same time, that has also raised the question what to do with it. Like, how do we want to support it? And I think all the integration comes with certain costs. And the question will be who will take this cost, and in which way this cost will be borne, who will pay for it. I think the matter of energy is maybe even more solvable than other questions on what to do with the pension system and what to do with the banking system. I honestly, I think when it happens, maybe now, like for instance, Ukraine will, let's say, hypothetically, Ukraine will also not allow Russian gas to flow through its pipes, and it will not go to Transnistria. You know, it can also go then via the Balkan Stream and via Turkey. So there's always a solution, but I think it might also push the Moldovan government to deal with it. To me, like the question has definitely come more on the agenda, but at the same time, I don't yet see a plan being crystallized there. And it again might be due to the lack of resources, and it's also a very sensitive issue. How do you do it? What voter rights you get to people? Because, you know, like these people will not vote for Maia Sandu's party. However, the region will be integrated. And would you give an autonomy to Transnistria? And if so, on which basis? Because Gagauzia has an autonomy on the ethnic basis. And in Transnistria, there is no difference in religion or ethnicity. So I think all these issues have to be discussed. But at the same time, I mean, one can argue, or like I would also say that the Moldovan government has been also taking gradually more measures to deleverage, both deleverage from Transnistria, but also put more pressure on the Transnistrian regime. And the Transnistrian regime, I mean, most of the exports also go now through Moldova, so there is also an overview of what's the situation and what's the trade in the Transnistrian region, and at the same time, I mean, there is an engagement also. It's not on a public level, and I also don't think it should be on the public level. But this topic will be also unpopular for elections, because if you look where Transnistria is on the issues that people care, this is very low on the agenda. And when you would say, okay, we need to pay as citizens of Moldova from our taxes for Transnistrian integration, that would also be quite challenging. I would still. So as answering like your question and wrapping it up, I don't think it's impossible to solve this conundrum. I think we are getting there, but I also think we need a maybe better plan on how to deal with it, and also more like we have to, the Moldovan government has to also come with a better vision of this, and also a timeline, because maybe we would need to have EU involved, for instance, as an external observer, and there has to be, I believe there has to be some kind of time of transition until Transnistria becomes fully part of Moldova. And in the integration with the EU, like Moldova, Transnistria is also benefiting from the DCFTA. So with the 90% of residents there having Moldovan citizenship, I also do not see how this can be prevented on an individual level. But of course, institutionally, that will be a challenge. And the last mention is also like Transnistria has a kleptocratic regime. How do we ensure that there is no spillover on the right bank of the river? So here I bring in Denis, I think.
Well, I agree with what Anastasia has pointed out, but I think that what probably can be added to that is that Transnistrian region is producing a cheaper electricity, which cannot be provided by Romania. Romania is not ready to subsidize Moldovan population at the moment, and I don't think that it has been any time kind of a discussion, public discussion in Romania, whether there is such a availability. I know that there is a certain amount of Romanian electricity that is sold as a lower price, but anyway, overall the price is double that is coming from the Transnistrian region. So we speak about affordability, not so much about the diversification, which is the political argument that is being used by the government. And is rightly used, of course. This is super important, but when it comes to energy poverty, which is very pregnant very visible and very impregnated in the public mentality of Moldova, you cannot really speak about diversification and that this is the priority when actually people, about 30% of the population is living in absolute poverty. And these are the recent statistics. So I think that even if it's not public, the topic of somehow how to separate the energy issue from the settlement of the conflict, I think that in the people's minds and in the minds of those politicians that are exploiting that, they usually will connect the two topics. So if we want the settlement of the conflict, then this is important because we can also keep buying and producing cheap electricity, which makes our goods more competitive on the local market, on the European market, which makes happier our customers because they don't have to pay higher prices. And it is also linked to the fact that the state cannot pay higher pensions and salaries. So it goes hand in hand. So the affordability is a very important topic that will be unfortunately lingering over the settlement of the Transnistrian conflict. Now, the second part, which is very geopolitical, and Anastasia didn't mention, but I will slightly touch upon it, is the situation in Ukraine and how the Russian aggression in Ukraine will end, and which will be the costs for Moldova, whether Transnistrian conflict will be part of the settlement of the dispute, of the conflict between Ukraine and Russia, or Russia and Ukraine. Because if Transnistrian conflict, it is used as a bargaining chip, then I think that Moldova will not be able to decide anything, to be honest, because there is also the EU, there is, we don't know, eventually Trump or even the US with another president that will be also kind of like facilitating a dialogue that will be necessary to stop the Russian aggression. Now, in order to speak about the European integration as a process to help settle the conflict, the dispute, the so-called Transnistrian conflict, then I think this is about costs. Moldova doesn't know exactly how much it will cost for its transition to EU standards, to implementation of the norms, to transition and to full approximation with the EU acquis, right, in all sectors. And here is exactly somehow touching a little bit on what you asked about the sectors that will be very complicated. The industrial policy, the competitiveness, many other areas that are simply where Moldova is at an early stages, they will require a lot of money. So now imagine how expensive that will be for the Transnistrian region, where during the Soviet time, 40%, if not more, of the industrial capacity of the country were located and are still located at the moment. So I think that we don't talk about that because there are other urgencies, including this political cost of how the Transnistrian population or Moldovan citizens in Transnistria will vote or can vote, as well as whether they can team up with Gagauzin autonomy and the voters in the northern administrative territories of Moldova, which have a very particular way of voting in terms of geopolitics. So there are many, many things that can be, put on the table, along with the costs for transformation of the social and monetary and economic policies in the Transnistrian region. So I think that we are far from that moment, but what will be definitely helpful is to understand how we are operating, which is the modus operandi, whether we are using the mechanism 5+2, and if not, because Ukraine doesn't want to hear about it as long as Russia is part of it, because it's an aggressor. So what else can be proposed to such an extent that it can be really be helpful for Moldova to somehow put in parallel two tracks, one of integration into the EU without actually abandoning or forgetting about the Transnistrian region, just because the fact that the countries are the two parts of the country are too different will be costly at some point than if we go with different speeds but in the same direction, as well as how you integrate the country, how you settle the conflict while you are so much dependent on the regional situation and on the geopolitical risks that the country is still facing and will be probably exposed to at least 2 years from now.
Thank you, Denis. Thank you, Anastasia. We have exhausted our time, unfortunately, yet we still have a couple of questions left. could I suggest the following? I will pick two questions, relating rather to what we have just been talking about, and ask each of our speakers to answer in 1 minute, very succinctly, before we then draw this webinar to a close. The first question I would like to pick is by an anonymous attendee, and it basically revolves around the credibility issue. So I give it to you, Anastasia, as you brought this issue up, the credibility of the European Union in upholding its pledge, being able or unable to uphold its pledge of granting EU membership eventually to Moldova. So if the whole referendum thing just bursts, it doesn't work out the way we all want it to work out, I suppose, most certainly Maja Sandu, how would that affect the attitude of the European Union vis-à-vis Moldova and its, or at least the government's ambition to bring it into the European Union? So that is for you. 1 minute, as I said, max. And the question that I would like to pose to you, Denis, is or has been posed by, where do we have it? Coralie Ballieu. And she actually asks, well, what is going to happen to the EU integration narrative in Moldova if eventually Sandu were to lose the presidential elections? Well, that is rather unlikely, I would argue. But what if eventually the legislative elections next year will not work out in her favor? What's going to happen to that narrative in Moldova? Would it be potentially be used by the opposition, current opposition, to their own favor, in their own favor, to their own benefits? Anastasia, the floor is yours first. Remember, be as concise as is possible, and then you, Denis, so we then afterwards draw the webinar to a close.
I have to start with a short anecdote that exactly the same questions Maja Sandu was asked in one meeting that I was attending. And I mean, I think the official answer would be that, you know, it will just take much slower time to integrate. However, I actually think it would really undermine the credibility of both the EU accession process and of Maja Sandu's party. In the end, even if they say they are not the one or the only one campaigning for the EU integration, they have built their party agenda and their party statements as a party that wants to bring Moldova in the EU. And when the EU referendum would fail, that also means, on the one hand, why should this government focus, or like any other government that comes, why should it focus on the EU accession if this is not what the people want? And on the second hand, I think that also will ask the EU, why should the EU pursue this support to Moldova when that's not what the people want, right? Like, I think in the end, one can argue that the results, if this to fail, that the results have been influenced by disinformation, by the Moldova's fragile situation, and so on and so forth. But I think that's why this referendum is such a risky one, because the stakes are very high. As much as we want to say that it just will slow down the process, I think it actually, depending on how also, of course, the war evolves and how the situation in the region is changing, but I think it will actually be a step backwards, and it will be very hard to do one more referendum like this again.
Well, I think that what will happen as a result of Maja Sandu's failure at the elections will be, as I already said, somehow influenced by the results in the referendum. But in my view, both the referendum and the poor result of Maja Sandu will be used to punish both the pro-EU forces in Moldova as well as the EU. So we will go through probably something very similar to what we had in 2014 after the banking fraud crisis of image of Moldova. But in this situation, which was somehow in parallel, also the crisis of image for the EU in Moldova. So I think that something very similar can happen now. But anyway, the elections that Moldova will hold next year will be influenced by the results of these elections. If Maja Sandu wins or loses, it will anyway be used by the pro-Russian forces to somehow reignite this geopolitical competition that is very, very visible in Moldova. I think it was not visible like that 10 years ago. We speak now about the geopolitical constellation in the region and about the bigger picture, which is the confrontation between Russia and the EU. And when you talk to EU officials and they tell you that the EU sees Russia as an existential threat to the European project, then you can imagine that this is also something very similar, but a very micro level for Moldova and the European integration process. But I want to be anyway optimistic a little bit, because I think that regardless if, I mean, this is a negative scenario, if it happens, I still believe that Moldova can recover because it showed that it can do that. And this is mainly due to the diaspora that Moldova has, and it's very much active. It has been active in Europe, and maybe this is also will be a cold shower for the diaspora that now is disappointed in what is happening in the country to a certain extent, and will be voting for other pro-EU parties, not even Maia Sandu's party, during the next elections. We don't know how it will play out, but what I know is that these results will mobilize the electorate. Will mobilize both the electorate of those who support the pro-Eurasian Union vector, as those who are big, avid advocates for European accession process for Moldova.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Anastasia. Thank you very much, Denis. And my apologies to our two speakers as well as our participants for having been such a lenient moderator when it comes to time management. It's not one of my strengths, I have to admit. But I would most certainly want to say that this was an extremely interesting webinar, a very interesting, thought-provoking and comprehensive conversation with the two of you. I would like to thank you sincerely, most sincerely, also on behalf of our consortium in the context of which this webinar has taken place. I would like to thank our participants for having stayed online, at least those that are still with us right now, and for having joined us in the first place. If you are interested to learn a little bit more about what we are doing in the context of this project, visit our website. We have just published a couple of very interesting blog posts. One, for instance, on Georgia's political party system, one on the new von der Leyen Commission, the proposed one at least, what it means for neighborhood and democracy support, a couple of very interesting working papers on the state of democracy in Eastern Europe, EU democracy funding. More is to come. And if, on that note, you are interested to learn about Georgia's upcoming elections, or by then eventually elections that have been held, the legislative elections, join us again at the end of October for our next webinar, where in fact we will be discussing these elections with Dr. Hans Gutbrot and Nino Dolice. For now, once again, I would like to thank Anastasia Pociumban and Denis Cenusa for today, for their insights, and to all of you, a very good evening wherever you are, and see you again soon. Thank you for today.
Thank you.
Thank you.